Good afternoon. On today's Angry Bulletin. Half a century ago, NASA proposed an idea that would transform the future of human civilization. It would provide us with all of the resources and power that our civilization might require for the next several centuries without doing any damage to our fragile environment. They thought it was possible 50 years ago, and Isaac Asimov actually thought that it was possible when he wrote a short story about the matter before the Japanese even attacked Pearl Harbor. And now NASA has come out with a study arguing that this new technology, I am of course talking about space-based solar power, is not going to be practical until the 2050s at the earliest, essentially throwing cold water on the entire project. And this may be the most damaging mistake that NASA has ever made. All of this and more coming at you on the Angry Astronaut right now. Good afternoon, and once again, welcome to the Angry Astronaut. Some of you may recall that last year I was writing a book. Some of you have actually prepaid for that book and may be disappointed that you haven't received it yet, and I understand. However, this video is about actually why the release of this book has been delayed. I'll try to give you a quick summary of what the book is about and why NASA has made it a bit more difficult for me to release it. The book is entitled How Starship Will Save the World. It may actually be retitled How SpaceX Will Save the World, but the idea is, with our current situation, with climate change, with the enormous amount of mining that takes place on this planet in order to sustain both our resource and power-hungry civilization, well, ultimately, this could result in the destruction of the environment, the destruction of the planet, and making this place almost uninhabitable. The reason Starship can stop all of this, can change these things, is to, first of all, make our power source, to make our utility companies essentially no longer something that operate here on Earth, no longer something that contributes to the destruction of the environment, something that no longer puts carbon into the atmosphere, a power source that dwells in space. A lot of you probably know what I'm talking about, solar power stations, because solar panels gather far more energy up in space than they do down here on Earth. They don't have the interference of the atmosphere. There's no nighttime in space if you put the solar panels into the right orbit, that is. And also, you can mine the necessary resources in order to build these things from asteroids, from the moon, and deliver these resources into Earth orbit actually far more efficiently and far less expensively than you can here on Earth if you build the necessary infrastructure and the necessary industry in space in order to take advantage of these resources. And all of this is only going to be made possible if the cost per kilogram of getting things out into space drops substantially. And that is what Starship can do, has much greater promise to do this than any other rocket that's currently in development. Could potentially drop the price of getting things out into space from where it is now, well over $2,000 per kilogram, down to maybe $100 per kilogram, or maybe even less than that. And if you can do that, then the potential of building these massive power stations out in space and also exploiting the resources out in space that would be necessary to build these things all becomes possible, in which case we no longer have to do anything that's damaging to our environment here on Earth. If this sounds familiar to you, well, this is exactly what Jeff Bezos is advocating as well, although his company doesn't seem to be working very hard or very quickly to make any of this happen. But here's the problem. NASA has come out with a study saying that all of this is not going to be practical until 2050 or so. That renewable and green energy sources that we're using right now, wind energy, solar energy, everything here on Earth, well, that's the way that we really need to go. And that only when there's a significant improvement in technology can we seriously entertain the idea of putting solar power stations in space. And this is in sharp contrast to what NASA was saying in the early 1970s when they were proposing the same solution for what was the energy crisis at the time. Why has NASA made such a radical change in their belief on this matter? Why are they arguing that this incredibly valuable application for spaceflight, perhaps the most valuable thing that could possibly be done in space, isn't going to be practical for a substantial amount of time? And so therefore, they are arguing against the importance of their own agency. How could this be happening? And do other space agencies look at this the same way? So let me start off with an easy answer to that question. No, other countries don't see it this way. For example, the Space Energy Initiative, which is a government project here in the United Kingdom, well, this is one of their promotional videos, and the UK is extremely interested in this solution, in bringing a carbon-free energy solution for the planet. Unfortunately, NASA has a completely different view of the whole situation. Their recent report examined two different architectures for building solar power stations in orbit, and both of them are far more expensive than renewable systems here on Earth, ranging anywhere from 61 cents per kilowatt hour to $1.59 per kilowatt hour, as opposed to terrestrial renewable systems which produce energy from anywhere from 2 cents to 5 cents per kilowatt hour. Obviously, a big win for terrestrial-based renewables. However, there are other details as well. The report also found that the greenhouse gas emission intensity for these sorts of systems, that is to say the amount of gases produced from building and launching such systems, was far less than that of the average U.S. electric grid today, but it was similar to terrestrial renewable systems. Once again, no big advantage for space. Quote, "We found that these space-based solar power designs are expensive. They are 12 to 80 times more expensive than if you were going to have renewable energy on the ground," said Erica Rogers, Science and Technology Partnership Forum Lead in NASA's Office of the Chief Technologist, in a presentation at the AIAA SciTech Forum Conference, where the agency released the report. And by the way, in case you're wondering how all of this could be accomplished, well, the idea is simply to build a very large solar array in orbit, kind of like putting together a Lego set in orbit, actually, assembling one solar panel after another after they're deployed by a large rocket such as Starship, and then once it's assembled, it gathers a tremendous amount of solar energy, far more than you can gather here on Earth, because you don't have the atmosphere interfering, you don't have clouds interfering, there's no night, at least in certain orbits around the Earth, and then beaming the energy down to Earth via microwave. This is a technology that's not just theoretical. Caltech did an experiment with this type of satellite, transmitting power from orbit down to Earth and actually transmitting energy back to the satellite, and it works perfectly. It all depends on the type of frequency you use. One of the most common objections to this type of power is the argument that the atmosphere will gobble up a lot of the energy before it ever reaches the rectenna on the ground. That is not true as long as you utilize a correct frequency. And as I mentioned before, this is not a new concept at all. Isaac Asimov predicted the existence of a solar power station in orbit way back in 1941 in a short story called Reason, where robots found religion and seized control of a solar power satellite, but by use of the first law, that is to say, not harming human beings, they worshipped the solar power station, but still used it for its intended purpose of beaming energy down to Earth without harming anybody in the process. Very interesting story, something that I read when I was a kid, by the way. So here's some common objections to space solar power. First of all, some people think that it's actually a space weapon that will be used to vaporize targets here on Earth. That's actually a theoretical use that it could have been used for in this Isaac Asimov story, but not in the proposed setup where they're utilizing low-energy microwaves to transmit the power. At most, it generates about a quarter the energy of a typical sunny day, so a little bit warm, but that's about it. What makes this better than terrestrial renewables? Well, as you can see here, an offshore wind farm consumes far more real estate than a space solar rectenna. It's much more efficient when we're talking about the use of space here on Earth and the amount of environment you have to destroy in the process of creating the power plant. And also, in terms of waste energy, it's much more efficient as well. Thermal power plants, the best thermal power plants, achieve approximately 60% thermal efficiency, which means you lose over 650 megawatt hours of waste heat into the environment for every gigawatt hour of electrical energy produced. Terrestrial solar farms are even worse, approximately 30% efficiency, and that's for future solar panels, by the way, not the ones that are currently used, and they release 2.3 gigawatts worth of heat into the environment for every gigawatt hour of electricity produced, whereas a space solar power rectenna has achieved 91% conversion efficiency, and that was all the way back in 1975. In a worst case scenario, with 85% efficiency, you're looking at 430 megawatt hours of heat released for every gigawatt hour worth of electricity. Far more efficient than any other solution. And because solar panels are so inefficient, and because the sun doesn't shine all the time, and because places like the UK are so ridiculously cloudy all the time, the typical year worth of energy that a UK solar panel gathers is about 37 sun days. In other words, 37 days worth of solar energy absorbed out of 365. Whereas if you put the same solar panels out into space, you get 497 sun days. How is that possible with only 365 days in the year? Well, because your solar panels are absorbing more energy in space than they could possibly absorb here on Earth because there's no atmosphere. The notoriously bad weather in the UK has actually led some people to propose an idea of putting a massive solar array in Morocco where the sun shines all the time, and then to transmit the energy or to ship it to the UK via good old-fashioned copper cables. And this is an idea that sounds very interesting because, after all, you get a lot more solar energy in Morocco, although keep in mind, you're still only looking at 92 sun days per year because of the efficiency of solar panels, and it's been estimated that a 10 gigawatt power system in Morocco is going to end up costing $65.7 billion to the UK taxpayer. By way of comparison, a solar power station with the same amount of energy, known as Cassiopeia, will cost an estimated $40.6 billion. Not according to NASA, of course, but according to more optimistic predictions, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it gets a lot worse than that. To build a power station this ambitious, and especially to build a network that's capable of delivering the power all the way to Britain, you need 96,000 tons of copper, 93,000 tons of steel, 61,000 tons of composites. That's 250,000 tons worth of materials that need to be mined and manufactured on Earth, which creates an enormous carbon footprint in the process, just to build a power station that's more efficient. And by the way, why do you need this kind of efficiency? Well, on cloudy days or on days where the wind isn't blowing, the UK power grid has to rely on carbon-producing power plants in order to make up for the difference. all the time. You're never going to be free of coal power plants, nuclear plants, whatever, if you go with terrestrial renewables. By way of comparison, the Cassiopeia satellite is estimated to consume approximately 1,000 tons, just 1,000 as opposed to 250,000 tons worth of raw materials in order to deploy it and in order to send it into orbit in the first place. That is a radical difference. And if you can mine those materials on asteroids or on the moon, that completely eliminates all the mining you have to do here on Earth. So why does NASA believe that this is going to be prohibitively expensive? Well, before we get to that, I would like to thank the following people who have signed up for Patreon just in the last couple of days. Mark Flug, Wes Clark, also Sue Anu, and I'm probably mispronouncing that. I do apologize. And then finally, ITL3. Because of folks like you, I can keep bringing you this content full time and also travel to some amazing events. For example, next week, there is an FAA space event in Washington, D.C. that I would really like to attend. Now, if I had 1% of my subscribers supporting me on Patreon, I wouldn't have to do any fundraising, but unfortunately I don't, and so if possible, I would really like to get your support in order to be able to attend this conference as a journalist, because there's going to be so many different launch providers there, so many space companies I'll be able to interview, and also my contacts at the FAA, who I may be able to get a lot more information from if I get an opportunity to meet them face to face. So, if it's something you'd like to support, all the details in the description. Let's conclude with NASA's argument against space-based solar. Here's the sum total of the problem that they have with space-based solar. They think that 70% of the cost, that is to say the launch costs, are going to be prohibitively expensive because launch costs are never going to be less than $1,000 per kilogram, even by 2050. Now, let me give you an idea of how much of an impact these pessimistic estimates have on the cost estimates that NASA put together for a solar power station. The total cost of one of these stations is $124.1 billion, according to NASA, and of that figure, $111.6 billion of that is launch costs. Over 90% of the total expense is launch costs, and that's assuming $1,000 per kilogram. What if it were $100 per kilogram, which is still far more than Elon Musk is anticipating can be delivered by Starship? Well, that drops the launch cost down by 90%, and then you're looking at a little north of $30 billion for one of these stations, as opposed to $124 billion. A massive, massive impact just by changing one estimate. And I don't think it's an overly optimistic point of view to assume that launch costs could drop by 90% using totally reusable rockets. Back in 1981, the space shuttle cost $85,000 per kilogram to deliver mass up into orbit. And then, contrary to popular belief, the shuttle was delivering mass at $27,000 per kilogram by 1995. And it's dropped so much since then. With Falcon Heavy, the price is $1,400 per kilogram, a 95% reduction since 1995. And yet NASA doesn't think that we're going to have more than a 30% reduction in launch costs by 2050. That is absurdly pessimistic, and in my opinion, completely illegitimizes this entire study. It's absurd, and it makes you wonder, why is NASA coming up with these kinds of figures? Well, one important factor: politics. In 2025, SLS is going to take the first astronauts to travel beyond low Earth orbit all the way out to the moon at a cost of $30,000 per kilogram. when you're talking about a rocket that might be able to deliver payload to orbit for $100 per kilogram, you really don't want to talk about that when your flagship rocket, the SLS, is costing that ridiculous amount of money. And in addition to that, there are quite a number of powerful political lobbyist groups who are looking to get renewables used here on Earth. Solar power lobbies, wind power lobbies, hydropower lobbies, none of them want to see an alternative that's more efficient, creates a smaller carbon footprint, and could still be delivered for roughly the same price as their solutions. Instead, they would like to bury an idea like that, and that is precisely what NASA is trying to do right now. Incidentally, if you would like to see some details from my book, because one of the things I have to do now is discredit this NASA study in this book, and that's going to take a lot of extra work that I wasn't planning to do, well, if you've already paid in advance, just send me an email and I will send you a couple of preview chapters so you at least get to read something while you're waiting for this book to come out. I do apologize for that, but rest assured, this will be coming out soon. Oh, one more thing I want to mention. Because we've proven that power can be transmitted both ways up to orbit, you can also transmit power from one power plant on Earth to a rectenna in a different location. What this means is, let's say that you have a nuclear power plant on Earth that you want to generate energy for a remote community. All you have to do is transmit the power up to a satellite and then retransmit it, again via microwave, down to a rectenna close to this community. That is a fantastic way to transmit power without having to use wires, a concept, by the way, that Nikola Tesla came up with almost a century ago. And incidentally, if the UK is absolutely determined to build this solar array down in Morocco, well, you could transmit the energy from that array to the United Kingdom without having to use all those copper wires via this system as well. So until we actually start looking at solutions like this seriously, until NASA reconsiders this absurdly narrow-minded perspective that they've taken on something that could make the maximum use of spaceflight, delivering an enormous benefit to the human species, far greater than just about anything we've ever thought of for space, well, I urge all of you to stay angry about space.